Chapter 6. Style, the Dilemma of Appropriation. In the summer of 1963, I stood in front of a black and white television, watching a baseball game between the San Francisco Giants and the hapless Chicago Cubs. I don't remember the inning or the score, just that Ron Santo, the Cubs' third baseman, hit a deep fly ball in the gap between right and center. The fans screamed. The batter took off. Most center fielders, even the great ones, would have to scramble to get to the ball and would shamelessly display the effort of getting there. Willie Mays drifted across the outfield like Charles Coles, the great tap dancer, whose footwork was so sweet and smooth that they called him Honey. He arrived at his spot under the baseball with no apparent sweat, even though he had to run for what seemed like miles to get there. Then, instead of raising his glove to catch the ball, the way every other outfielder was taught since Little League to catch the ball, Mays placed his glove at his belt buckle, like a basket, and made the catch. Plop! Santo kicked the ground in disgust. Cubs fans groaned and sat back down. Mays had turned a potentially dramatic moment into a routine out. The most memorable part of the play is what took place after Mays made the catch. He nonchalantly picked the ball out of his glove, tossed it back to the infield, coolly walked back to center field, flicked his sunglasses back up, and waited for the next play. His body language suggested annoyance that the batter hadn't presented a greater challenge. This was the highest, subtlest form of put down, an unspoken challenge to the other team and to the sports establishment that still frowned on any hint of flash and couldn't make sense of Mays signifying around this thing called black style, a way of acting and talking in a coded way, communicating through gestures and body language. When I think back on that catch and how it struck me, I realize I felt that Mays was talking to me, the way he ran, the way he made the hip catch, the way he coolly walked back to center field. The catch itself, the act of making a putout, was secondary to the style of the catch. Mays made deep inroads into my psyche that afternoon. Until I saw Willie Mays play, the idea of playing sports with soul had never entered my mind. Willie Mays introduced me to a dimension of style I thought only existed in jazz. I always knew music had the power to transport. A few years earlier, I stood in the basement of my grandmother's house in Phoenix, Illinois, pouring through piles of 78s she'd collected over the years. The record that stuck most in my mind was a tune called Liza, or The Clouds A Roll Away, by Chuck Webb's band, featuring a punchy three-chorus trumpet solo. What attracted me was the cleverness with which the trumpet player had taken the basic theme of the piece, played around with it, turned it inside out, and interpreted it to his liking. Until I saw Willie Mays make that basket catch, the idea of playing sports with the same sort of interpretive style had never entered my mind. I didn't realize that each of the elements that made blues-based music swing, its soul, had a counterpart in sports: the phrasing, the lyricism, the improvisation. The difference was that in sports, the instrument was the body of the artist. From then on, I watched Willie Mays whenever I could. Watched the way he ran, the way he hit. I went outside and tried the basket catch. I tossed the ball up or had someone hit it to me. The ball landed on my head, hit my chest, fell to my right or my left. Catching a fly ball was hard enough. Making it look easy was impossible. I never learned to make the basket catch, but I was determined that whatever I did, mow the lawn, rake the leaves, play a sport, I would do it with the graceful ease and cool of Willie Mays. There was something magnetic about Mays, not just the basket catch or the speed, but the familiar nuances I recognized in his body language. I felt so much in that catch, jazz and blues, and all the R&B I loved. I felt the signifying, the dozens, all that in this one simple play. Over the next 5 decades, Willie Mays' cool became my standard. Playing greatness wasn't enough. You had to play with style and soul. What I didn't realize at age 12 was that you didn't just get soul, you had to earn it, to pay for it, and the price of this ticket was steep. Before Willie Mays came along, Jackie Robinson had introduced a restrained version of the same soul to mainstream American sports by virtue of his pioneering role in Major League Baseball. The late Curt Flood said, "When Jackie Robinson first started playing, everyone was surprised at his antics. He stole second base. He stole third. Jackie Robinson stole home. It was something unheard of. Jackie Robinson dancing off the base, worrying the pitcher, and wanting him to throw to first base and saying things. That style of baseball came from the old Negro leagues. That is the way they played. Now you add to it the hit and run, the sacrifice, the stolen base, the hit behind the runner, and jockeying in and off base. That's the style that Jackie Robinson brought. Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby and George Crowe and Monty Irvin and these guys raised the level of competition, and they did it with style. Robinson was a star, but in a larger sense he was a celebrity, a monument to the black pioneer in sports, the black man who integrated Major League Baseball. Robinson came from the Negro Leagues but was not necessarily of the Negro Leagues. He did not revel in Negro League lore. Robinson endured the experience because he had to. Robinson had been conditioned to the white life at UCLA and in junior college. He had heard the white crowds roar and may have rather longed for the right to live that life. Indeed, it was his association with white institutions that made him attractive to Branch Rickey as the Negro pioneer to integrate white baseball. He picked up his style from the Negro Leagues, but he also knew how to tailor it to the majors. Willie Mays was the first young African American sports superstar. Jackie Robinson was 28 when he reached the majors, while Mays joined the Giants at age 20. He was the symbol of a young, black vitality that mainstream America had never seen because African Americans had thus far been excluded from mainstream sport. Mays became as significant to the late 1950s as Jackie Robinson had been in the late 1940s. Robinson integrated sports racially, but Mays completed the job, integrating sports stylistically. Where Robinson's great significance had been in being the first, Mays' significance was his great talent and distinctive style. Where Robinson's presence in Major League sports announced that black players were good enough to compete, Mays' generation announced that black athletes could do more than compete. They could redefine the very game. Mays was the cornerstone of a second wave of African American superstars who introduced a new dimension of soul into sports. In his 3-volume treatise on baseball, David Quinton Voigt said that American sports by the 1950s, particularly Major League Baseball, had begun to level off in popularity and had become boring. Indeed, Voigt said, these were mostly clean-shaven, crew-cut white boys. There was no denying their colorlessness. The American-born white athlete was bound by a certain order and custom. The black presence, beginning with Robinson, added flavor, color, and finally drama. This presence also superimposed the conflicts and complexities of race on the national pastime. Mays' style broke barriers that had not formally been erected yet. His style defied the American white way of playing in all its sterility. By the time Mays came to New York in 1951, black athletes were still a new commodity in mainstream athletics, but they no longer had to bear the entire weight of a nation's race consciousness. The National Basketball Association color barrier was broken in 1951 by Nathaniel Sweetwater Clifton with the Knicks, Earl Lloyd with the Detroit Pistons, and Chuck Tarzan Cooper with the Boston Celtics. The National Football League was integrated in 1947 by Woody Strode and Kenny Washington. Sports, like jazz, became a free space in which black athletes were free to make powerful statements using gestural modes of expression to celebrate, honor, and even chide. Jackie Robinson had to watch every P and Q, had to dot every I and cross every T, because he was the first and couldn't afford to be perceived as flashy or arrogant or some kind of hot dog. Because Robinson had gone through all that, Mays had the luxury of being lavishly creative. He could stretch the margins, like the boxer Muhammad Ali a decade later and the musician Charlie Parker a decade earlier. Mays was so far above the rest of the field that it seemed as if he were playing a new game. In many ways he was. He changed the rules. From his seemingly leisurely method of catching a ball to his propensity for going from first to third on an infield out as a defensive player with explosive speed, he raised the standard for an extra base hit in the gaps between the outfielders. Mays' speed and daring fielding style effectively closed those gaps. Miles Davis introduced mainstream America to cool and hipness and jazz in the late 1950s. Willie Mays introduced a flair and cool style in sports. He introduced the black thing to a mainstream public that devoured it, and has been devouring it ever since. The popularity of sports that blacks dominate today coincided with the beginning of this stylistic transformation of the game, the opening up of the game to this new way of playing. Willie Mays presaged this stylistic contour in sports. This form of integration, in the long run, would be far more traumatic for white authority figures than the mere physical presence of black players. It was this stylistic integration that led white sons and daughters to embrace the black thing in every part of their lives, from style of play to clothes to language. In virtually every decade since the 1950s, black athletes have been at the core of some stylistic or structural innovation in sports, from the alley-oop pass and the spin move in basketball to the spike and the ritual of the end zone shimmy in football, from slapping palms to donning baggy pants and executing wildly creative dunks and elaborate end zone celebrations. The African American presence in sports has redefined and reordered the traditional way of doing things. Whether it was Jackie Robinson's daring on the base paths, Muhammad Ali's mocking brilliance and fire in the ring, Wilma Rudolph's willowy grace and speed, or Michael Jordan's aerial exploits, black athletes have brought to the field a tantalizing mix of ingenuity and grace, sensuality and strength, beauty and violence, rage and vulnerability. In the process, they have invented a new American art. Mays introduced the notion that black athletes played with a style that catapulted them to another level and separated them from the pack. He established that there was a level of artistry in athletics that could be attained through black style, a level that could not, at that point, be reached by white players, who were too often shackled by limitations and expectations imposed by the very conventions Mays challenged. Ultimately, this new black style, symbolized by Mays, would become the cornerstone of America's multi-billion-dollar sports industry. This elusive phenomenon has kept millions of Americans lining up for tickets and ultimately pouring over $34 billion a year into the ever-expanding sports industry. The dilemma for the black community is that in the post-integration world, the community has no right, no claim, indeed no way to profit from this soul. The dilemma for the sports industry was that as the appetite for black style increased, so did the black presence on the fields of mainstream sports. As black players and style took center stage, so did a rising tension over style. The dilemma for stewards of the game was that this flashy style was terribly effective and wildly exciting. Fans were coming out to watch in droves. The industry's sudden dependence on a style that many executives and media big mouths were uncomfortable with only increased the tension. In other words, not everyone was enthralled by Mays. For all those who loved Mays, there were fans who became agitated by his style of play. The cap that always seemed to fly off when he ran, the basket catch, the dramatic way he ran the bases. Critics called him a showboat, a hot dog. Once the novelty of Robinson and Mays wore off and the march of black athletes into the mainstream began, the knee-jerk American racism toward the African American accomplishment, indeed toward the mere presence of African Americans, surfaced. This was the same reflex that eliminated blacks from baseball in the 19th century. squeezed cyclists out of bicycle racing, forced black jockeys out of horse racing, and kept black football players out of the NFL. A revealing insight into the resentment integration generated can be found in the anonymous remarks of a sports writer in 1951. Willie Mays had helped the Giants to a World Series showdown with the New York Yankees. In the final game, the Giants started three African Americans in the outfield: Mays, Monty Irvin, and Hank Thompson. The first time such a thing had ever happened. The anonymous sports writer wrote, "Willie Mays is in a daze, and Thompson's lost his vigor. But Irvin waxed for all the blacks. Ain't it good to be a nigger?" A backlash had started to set in. Had Mays come along 3 decades later, he would have had a tremendous integrated fan base. But in his era, white fans never fully identified with him. Mays arrived at the Polo Grounds for the 1951 season 4 years after Jackie Robinson had integrated baseball, and the people who ran sport and business were not certain that the middle-class Americans who were their customers were ready for African Americans to be promoted as stars, like Mickey Mantle or Joe DiMaggio or Ted Williams. At the same time, Mays was beginning his career at the Polo Grounds. The Yankees brought up Mickey Mantle, a powerful Oklahoma-born home run hitter, blue-eyed and blonde, nursed in the heartland of America. Mantle and Mays became cultural icons in America in different manners. Mantle was the embodiment of dairy farms, rolling acres of corn, apple pie, and the flag. Mays was simply a great player. He had his fans and his money. Willie Mays was well compensated, but the element of perceived intimacy and familiarity that made Mickey Mantle a folk hero and pulled even cold characters like Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams into the nation's bosom remained just beyond Mays' grasp. Just as a black sports writer could never be Red Smith and Hank Aaron could never be Babe Ruth, Mays would never eclipse Mantle as a cultural icon, no matter what he did. As heroes go, Mays had hit a glass ceiling. Implied in his easy manner, his blasé attitude after a great play, and the nonchalance was an implied "fuck you." He made it clear that his style was him, and for those who couldn't appreciate it for the genius it was, there would be no grinning and jiving to win them over. He'd given up on that. A style of play that had found an easy home and wide appreciation in the Negro Leagues was still too black to sit comfortably with mainstream America, even as many white Americans were thrilled and fascinated by it. The isolation and invisibility, the bitter awareness of being accepted but not embraced, and the anger at this cultural glass ceiling, feelings that athletes like Mays shared with the majority of the black population of the country, also played out in Mays' soulful style of play. That was part of what attracted me to Mays that afternoon in Wrigley Field when he made the basket catch. He wasn't being cool for the sake of being cool. He was cool out of a genuine urge to make a performance of the most basic athletic acts, to fully exercise his skill and creativity and his desire for jubilant expression. But Mays was also literally cool, in his air of detachment and resignation. This graceful ease and cool has come to be broadly associated with African American athletes. It's part of what makes them so fascinating and appealing. But this distinctive style is also a reflection of powerlessness on the part of African American athletes. For Mays, that famous style and soul came at the price of staying in segregated hotels, eating in segregated restaurants, and dealing with the daily bombardment of racism. For black athletes as a whole, that style in some ways underlines their inability to define themselves in more substantive ways and find acceptance. So, rather than try to fight it, to argue or plead for the acceptance that they'd never find, many black athletes let that damaged soul bleed out of them in their style on the field. But even that style, so hard-earned, is a precarious possession, one that can be and has been criticized, legislated out of existence, appropriated instantly and without compensation. By the time I saw Mays in Wrigley Field that summer afternoon in 1963, The blush of innocence had long since faded. Mays was no longer the bubbly 19-year-old say hey kid who come up from Alabama to New York City. He was a seasoned, slightly bitter 31-year-old veteran. Mays had weathered 11 major league seasons. The basket catch and his unrestrained, flashy style of play, which had startled the stodgy baseball establishment when he broke into the league, had become old hat. His style had been copied, emulated, and improved upon, and of course, appropriated by the system. His glory days with the New York Giants, gleefully playing stickball in the streets of Harlem on his days off, were past. Indeed, his team had moved 3,000 miles to San Francisco, physically uprooting Mays from the inner city. At Mantle's funeral in 1995, sportscaster Bob Costas, reflecting on his own youth, recalled that Mantle was a player, quote, we emulated and identified with. His blonde hair, his blue eyes, the way he rounded the bases after a home run, eyes down in a sort of humble, workmanlike humility. I don't know which, quote-unquote, we Bob was referring to, but the we I knew was out in the street trying to emulate Mays' basket catch. People discovered that, hey, there's another level of this game that can be played higher through the jumping mechanism, not just being able to run and catch. You can leave your feet and make a catch above everybody else. That was an era that had been untapped, R.C. Owens said. Owens is largely unknown to contemporary fans, and his greatest contribution to football is associated with basketball, the alley-oop. 6 years after Mays broke in with the baseball giants, R.C. Owens, a 6'5" offensive end, was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers of the National Football League. Owens was part of the third wave of post-integration African-American athletes, those who followed Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays into the mainstream of United States pro sports. This third wave included Bill Russell, who revolutionized defensive play for centers in the National Basketball Association, and was a rookie with the Boston Celtics in 1956. Jim Brown, a running back who combined speed, power, and grace, and was a rookie running back with Cleveland in 1957. Curt Flood, who shook the sports foundation by challenging baseball's reserve clause, and had become the St. Louis Cardinals' regular center fielder in 1958. And Elgin Baylor, a rookie with the Minneapolis Lakers in 1958, who introduced hang time and walking on air to pro basketball. The difference between this wave of black athletes and Mays' generation was volume. There was more of them. More of us came on the scene at the same time athletically as potential superstars, Owens said. We were all coming out at the same time. We were playing well. People were seeing a lot of different things. They were seeing a different style. Each wave of black athletes has had to negotiate the changing face of racism. Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby battled exclusion, fought against the idea that blacks lack skills. Willie Mays proved that African Americans could play and often had to play at a higher level than their white counterparts. The wave of contemporary black athletes of which Owens was a part faced a more discrete form of racism, the beginning of the more abstract racism that would confront successive waves of black athletes as the white-dominated power structure maneuvered to maintain the black labor, white profit paradigm in the one area in which blacks were becoming dominant, sports. R.C. Owens played for San Francisco beginning in 1957. After a stellar basketball and football career at the College of Idaho, Owens was originally drafted in 1956, but put off his pro football career for a year and toured the nation with an all-star basketball team. Owens introduced verticality to the sport in a way it had never been used. His basketball skills, specifically his jumping ability, laid the foundation for an aerial innovation that is known primarily as a basketball term, but originated in pro football, the alley-oop. Throughout the history of football, offensive ends and halfbacks had to outjump opposing defensive backs for the ball. Owens' alley-oop innovation, however, marked the first time a player's superior jumping ability was formally inducted into a team's playbook. The concept behind the pass was simple. The quarterback dropped back and lofted a high arching pass in Owens' direction. As an accomplished basketball player, Owens understood the rhythm and timing of jumping and the importance of securing position and using leverage. It was that basketball instinct that enabled me to make those catches, he said. Owens ran to the point of reception and leaped to take it away from the defender. For Owens, style became a tool for survival. He realized that if he planned to make the team, he had to do something different. Fortunately for the 24-year-old rookie, he could jump at a time when jumping was not considered to be an integral part of the game. For Owens, the value of style was not simply that it came easy, that it was cultural or instinctive. No, for Owens, developing style was a matter of survival. Style actually improved his game. At the very least, it ensured that no one would miss what he was doing on the field. Whatever you were doing, you had to do it in an exceptional way. Everybody could judge you, could see that you performed, you excelled. You could run, you could catch, you can block, you can tackle. Because whatever you're doing it with great style and fashion. Owens' approach to coping with racism was simple and consistent with the prevailing mentality of many African Americans faced with carrying a burden of proof. Perform. You would always say beneath your breath, "Play me and I'll show you." And if you got the chance to catch the ball, make sure you score. Or if you know you're not going to get a long pass and you get a short one, you better turn it into a touchdown. You better be inventive and come up with a performance. That's precisely how the alley-oop came into existence in 1957's Owens' rookie season. The 49ers had lost their opening game of the season 20-10 to the Chicago Cardinals and faced the Los Angeles Rams the following week. The coaches were looking for a way not to be 0-2, Owens recalled. In practice, the week before the game, the offense was running the Rams' plays, and Frankie Albert, the 49ers coach, exhorted Y.A. Tittle, the quarterback, to throw long passes in order to give the defense an idea of what the Rams would do on Sunday. So Tittle lofted several high passes downfield, which Owens went up and grabbed and easily outjumped the 49ers defensive backs. After watching Owens make a couple of these catches, an excited Albert said, "He's just outjumping them for the ball. We've got to put that play in." On Sunday, Owens made 2 leaping touchdown catches in the end zone to lead the 49ers to a come-from-behind 23-20 victory. He scored on a 46-yard pass when he made an impossible catch over the outstretched arms of a defender. Trailing 20-16 in the fourth quarter, Tittle rolled out and hit Owens. The 49ers kept the play in the books and started winning. On November 4th, Owens caught a 41-yard pass over Jim David and Jack Christensen from Tittle to beat Detroit 35-31 with 11 seconds left. This boosted their record to 5-1. Owens' jumping ability allowed him to become a big play receiver as a rookie. In his rookie season, Owens caught 27 passes, half as many as his teammate Billy Wilson, who led the NFL with 52 catches. But Owens averaged 14.6 yards, the same as Wilson, and scored only 1 touchdown fewer with 5. In all but one of his 8 pro seasons, Owens, who is now the director of the 49ers Alumni Association, averaged double-digit yards per reception, including a high of 20.4 yards per catch in 1959. For his career, Owens averaged 15.9 yards per catch on 206 receptions. Style became a tool to circumvent racism and bias against black players by their own coaches. It forced those coaches to pay attention. Owens said that for him, the value of style was that it allowed black players to keep coming up with something different, so the players would say, "Coach, we've got to use that." Or the coach would say, "We're going to put that in." Or, "We're going to give him the ball more." If it continued to happen more and more and more, you'd reach the point where they couldn't keep black players out of the starting lineup. For Owens, devising a unique style was meant to ensure that he was one of those 2 or 4 African American athletes who made the team. You had to come up with a style so that the world would say, wow, this guy is jumping out of the stadium, Owens said. Or if it was Willie Gallimore, they'd say, man, this guy's so fast, he's like a cloud of dust. Willie the Wisp Gallimore was the prototype of the new wave running back in the NFL. Gallimore, who died in a car accident in 1963, was an electrifying runner who still ranks 6th on the Bears' all-time rushing list. Smooth, fast, quick with flashing moves, Gallimore ran at a level that other players who ran the ball just couldn't reach, Owens said. He was one of a kind at the same time. Of course, pretty soon you got more players who were black, and soon everyone was a cloud of dust. It became like a domino effect. First, the running backs, then the receivers, then the defensive backs to cover them, and the big, fast defensive linemen and linebackers to keep up with them, and big mobile offensive linemen to block bigger, faster defensive players. Faced with an expanding influx of black athletes, owners, in conjunction with general managers, coaches, and managers, set artificial limits on the number of black athletes who would make their teams. These were quotas, Owens recalled. Usually there were 2 black guys on the team, maybe 4. Rarely you saw an odd number. Usually it was 2 or 4. In time, quotas would be augmented by a system of steering black players to certain positions that required instinct, not thought. In football, the stereotype, enforced by men with power, was that African Americans were not smart enough to be quarterbacks or centers and guards. On defense, they would not play free safety or middle linebackers. In baseball, blacks would be put in the outfield, not at shortstop or second base. Being a head coach or manager in any sport was out of the question. Owens' generation had to push against those stereotypes, but first they had to get out on the field in any way they could. Their weapons were style and talent. That combination became a formula for winning in the box office and on the field. The black thing, as unnerving as it may have been to some, was profitable and entertaining, and therefore irresistible. Why did it take black players to introduce style into sports in a more conspicuous way? Before Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays reached the big stage, style was regarded as impractical in American sports. In fact, style was all about the absence of style. Sports were supposed to showcase, quote-unquote, the moment of truth, strength against strength, preparation against preparation. The most beloved athletes embodied an "aw shucks" humility that remains at the heart of the American self-image of so-called innocence. This model of sports heroism, however, was in a constant clash with the express yourself, do your thing imprimatur of black style. The struggle between the 2 styles continues down to this day, but it's pretty clear who's winning the battle these days. Owens has watched this evolution. If you don't have that kind of flashy game today to help you down the floor in a full court pass, you might not be playing first team or be on the team at all. You might be on the sideline looking. You've got to have an attitude. You have to have that pizzazz. That's today. But when Owens broke into the NFL in 1957, having an attitude was the kiss of death for African American athletes. Attitude was one of the racial buzzwords to describe black athletes in the negative. Having an attitude problem once was the sole province of black athletes. Attitude meant a chip on the shoulder, a surly demeanor. 4 decades later, Madison Avenue has converted attitude into a positive. Attitude is good. Attitude is hip and bold. Even inanimate objects have the desirable attitude. A car with an attitude, a piano with an attitude, and so on. Owens was traded to Baltimore in 1962. The coach was Weeb Ewbank. One day in practice, Owens blocked the field goal by standing on the goal line and jumping up and swatting the ball away if it was kicked low enough. He approached Eubank with the idea of trying it in a real game. Eubank liked the idea. In the waning moments of a game, Washington's Bob Kayat lined up for a 40-yard try. Owens stood in front of the uprights, which were then on the goal line. The kick was on the line and appeared to have the distance, but Owens leaped and knocked the ball away. Owens' block was the first and only field goal attempt ever to be rejected at the goal post in an NFL game. They changed the rule. You can't be in the goal post area anymore, Owens said. This is the jockey syndrome, changing the rules to stifle black excellence, applied to style. There have been other rule changes over the years of this sort. Because of Wilt Chamberlain, the nimble 7'1" center who played for the University of Kansas, the National Collegiate Athletic Association widened the lane from 8 feet to 12 feet, instituted offensive goaltending, and forbade the foul shooter from crossing the free throw line until the ball hit the basket. Chamberlain would dunk his missed free throws. With the entry of Bill Russell in 1956 and Chamberlain in 1959, the era of the tall, lumbering goon was on its way out. Russell was tall at 6'9", but as fast as many of the point guards in the NBA. Historian David Habelstam said of Russell's innovation, "In the past, the dominating big players had been white, usually strong but slow. When they blocked a shot, it was generally because the offensive players had taken a poor shot. Russell was something completely new, the forerunner of a different player in a different game, the big man who got down court faster than the other team's small men. He blocked shots that had never been blocked before. Players on other teams not only had to correct the arc of their shots, but change the very nature of their offense when they played against him." In 1966, the National Collegiate Athletic Association adopted legislation outlawing the dunk. The legislation was named at neutralizing the presence of Lou Alcindor, an agile 7'2" center who dominated competition in high school, college, and the pros from 1963 to 1989. In 1990, the NCAA banned celebration. This included prohibiting players from taking off their helmets and from praying in the end zone. It also banned taunting. Of course, some of the recent rule changes have been less about style than simply about race. In the great tradition of the jockey syndrome, one promoter even attempted to place quotas on how many Kenyans could compete in a marathon. R.C. Owens said, "It's like they made the free throw lane wider because you had too many guys like Russell and Chamberlain. So, well, guys adjusted. Guys started flying. You can make it as wide as you want to. It won't stop you from flying." The rules have proven futile, however, and have simply led to greater innovations. Instead of encouraging white suburban guards, for example, the three-point shot simply produced more outstanding African-American outside shooters. The no-dunk rule heightened the innovation and creativity of players driving to the basket. The introduction of African-American athletes to the mainstream marked the beginning of a tremendous influx of black football and basketball players to previously segregated Southern schools. It also marked the beginning of an intense struggle to control the extent to which African-American style was expressed through sports. For me, one of the most dramatic signals that this battle had been lost was the Cotton Bowl game on New Year's Day, 1991, when the University of Miami met the University of Texas. At the time, Miami was nationally known and popular for a raucous style of play that included taunting, exuberant celebrations, and a steady flow of quote-unquote commentary that drove opponents to distraction. The Hurricanes games were a combination of performance and pro wrestling match. The players danced, postured, and gestured after big plays. Earlier in the season, the school's president, Edward Foote, had warned the football team to tone its act down after a particularly ugly brawl at Brigham Young University. Accordingly, in the week leading up to this particular Cotton Bowl game, the Miami players were on their best behavior. I remember one interview session in which a couple of Miami players actually helped officials set up chairs. Meanwhile, the Texas players, enjoying a resurgent season after several down years, were talking trash. They talked and talked without admonishment. Stan Thomas, an offensive lineman for the Longhorns, referred to Miami players as hooligans and thugs, and talked about how he was going to stomp the Hurricanes into the ground. On game day, Miami whipped the Longhorns' collective asses without mercy and with great pleasure. But what was intriguing was the manner, the, quote, "what's my name" style in which Miami won. The Hurricanes began taunting Texas players before the game even started. The Longhorns could hear the Miami players shouting through the locker room doors before the players came out for pregame introductions. When Texas ran onto the field, they were stunned to find Miami players greeting them as if they were a welcome wagon, with obscene gestures and taunts. On the opening kickoff, Chris Samuels, the Texas kick returner, was knocked cold and the tone was set. The Miami offense, on its first possession, received 3 consecutive penalties, all for various unsportsmanlike conduct, and faced 40 yards to go for a first down. They made up the yardage on 3 passes. The Miami defense held Texas to minus 4 yards of total offense in the first quarter. Miami won 46-3. Randall "Thrill" Hill caught a touchdown pass and ran out of the end zone all the way up the ramp, shouting with glee, "It's too easy, it's too easy." Another player strode up and down the Miami sideline like a drum major in an exaggerated high kick as the route continued. I felt a little guilty for enjoying the spectacle so much. This wasn't so much a lopsided defeat as vengeance. It was also great theater. Indeed, the way Miami won was what reverberated all the way up to the press box. As the game went on, I alternated my view from the field, where the Hurricanes were taunting and dancing and manhandling Texas as though they were rag dolls, to the press box, where the game was being observed with tightened jaws, stern, puffy red faces, and gritted teeth. After the game, there were renewed calls from the media to, quote, "do something" about the boisterous, intimidating, increasingly vocal, and demonstrative style of play that was becoming so prevalent at virtually every level of competition. Will McDonough, the late columnist for the Boston Globe, wrote a scathing piece that more or less echoed the usual, quote, "loose ball" mentality. You could feel the venom. He started off by observing that, quote, "this has been in the making for close to 2 decades. 2 decades? That just about takes us back to the beginning of integration in the South, when large, predominantly white football universities began in earnest to get black athletes to come to their universities to play revenue-producing sports." McDonough continued, quote, "sooner or later, the street would take over, and it did in the Cotton Bowl in Dallas on Tuesday, when the University of Miami players delivered college football's version of wilding." He said that the Miami players, quote, "exposed themselves as thugs for hire with their conduct, which included 16 penalties for 202 yards, 4 unsportsmanship conduct calls, 5 personal fouls, and a stench that will stay with Miami for a long time." The Hurricanes, McDonough said, had gone, quote, "beyond the limits of decency" for taunting the poor, defenseless Texas players, intimidating them in pregame warm-ups, then dancing like fools every time they scored a touchdown, and generally being obnoxious throughout the game. McDonough warned that the football powers at Boston College, then considering allowing Miami entry into the Big East Conference, should be asking, do we really want to be in the same conference with these people and expose our players to this garbage year after year? Is this college football? Is this what we want to bring into our stadium? Of course, the answer to that question is simple. Yes, yes, hell yes. The Big East begged Miami to join the league to bring in the very luster and hot dogging that so disgusted McDonough. I loved the Miami performance. Loved it probably for all the wrong reasons. Loved it in large part because of the contradictions it represented. White universities embraced this Faustian pact 2 decades earlier when they began bringing black athletes to their campuses by the truckloads. They wanted black muscle, but not the attendant zeal and style. They somehow thought these athletes would all arrive at their campuses as sanitized as Jackie Robinson. They pretended these athletes weren't going to arrive with their own baggage that a history of living in a white supremacist country had helped to pack. Style, as we've seen, developed over a long period. It developed on plantations, and then on segregated fields of play. It developed in response to quotas and denials of black humanity. This historically essential element of black sportsmen was not going to vanish into the ether simply because they were now playing in leagues controlled by whites. Dennis Erickson, the Miami coach, told his players before the Cotton Bowl game to do what they had to do to win, which is what the Hurricanes did. Fifth-year senior Darren Handy said the players ignored Erickson's supposedly repeated demands for good behavior because, quote, emotions just took over. It might be embarrassing to the university and the coaches, but it's not to the players, Handy said. We enjoy it. Later, Hill explained that the game was a signature performance for Miami. This senior class is the last of the renegade classes, and we went out the way we wanted to, dancing and having fun. Dancing, having fun, how this troubled the press and other precincts of power in college football. At any rate, I left the press box that evening with a sense of satisfaction. The chickens, as Malcolm X had said, had once again come home to roost. For all the emotional satisfaction that aggressive displays of black style offer to black athletes and fans, the question, however, remains, given all the benefits that black style, a style forged in the flames of discrimination, segregation, quotas, and dehumanization, brought to white team owners, universities, and leagues, did it do anything to enhance black power in the industry, or was it just assimilated, albeit with some difficulty, into the existing power dynamic of white control black talent? As black style became more popular, who really benefited? Did this black style, carved out of black suffering and creativity, ever become black power? Quite the contrary. Designers like Ralph Lauren, Donna Karan, and Tommy Hilfiger quickly became cornerstones of the hip-hop industry. Motown founder Berry Gordy sold his 15,000 Motown songs to EMI Publishing. Bob Johnson created the first African-American cable TV network, then sold his company to Viacom for $3 billion. 5 years later, Essence magazine was sold to Time Warner. Call it sold on the auction block. The fact is that black style was quickly commoditized by white power, which became addicted to this other new form of black gold. The integration of intercollegiate sports in the mid-1970s created an insatiable appetite for black athletes, which in turn triggered a strip mining of black communities across the United States. Talented young black athletes and their families were wooed and pursued with the promise of scholarships and often material gifts. Black athletes had become a vital commodity in the sports industry, which necessitated a full-service delivery system to identify, prepare, and carry black muscle to quote-unquote market. That system is the conveyor belt.